Awaken your spirit. Chosen ones. History has a strange habit of apologizing very late, but when it does, it brings receipts. For a long time, your reality was treated like an inconvenience, not because it lacked truth, but because it disrupted comfort. You weren't dismissed gently either. You were dismissed efficiently, labeled, side-eyed, psychoanalyzed by people with no credentials except confidence and a group chat. The kind of dismissal that doesn't argue with you. It simply files you under problematic and moves on. And for a while, it worked. Silence became policy. Doubt became tradition. You were expected to shrink, self-correct, or conveniently unravel so the story could end neatly. Here's the uncomfortable fact that changes everything. Most wrongful narratives collapse not because the victim proves sanity, but because the lies become too heavy to carry consistently. False stories require maintenance. They need coordination, memory, and actors who don't get sloppy. And people always get sloppy. Patterns start repeating. Timelines stop lining up. Someone forgets what they said last year and confidently says the opposite this year, like nobody owns a calendar or screenshots anymore. That's when the air in the room shifts. What makes this moment different isn't sympathy, it's documentation. Cold, boring, unbothered documentation. The kind that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't need therapy, and definitely doesn't care about anyone's personal feelings. Proof has no tone, no mood swings, and no interest in being liked. It just sits there, silent and undefeated, waiting for the right moment to ruin somebody's favorite lie. And now, inconveniently, that moment has arrived. There's also something almost ironic about how fast people suddenly become concerned once evidence shows up. The same folks who told you to calm down are now speaking in hushed voices, acting like this whole thing is very serious, which it apparently wasn't when it was only happening to you. Funny how reality becomes valid once it's stapled together and time-stamped. Turns out you weren't unstable, you were early. This isn't about revenge, dramatics, or a victory lap. It's about a quiet, irreversible shift. The story has changed hands. The burden of explanation has moved. And the justice coming isn't loud or theatrical. It's precise, slightly awkward, and deeply inconvenient for anyone who benefited from pretending you were the problem. Number 1. The proof didn't come to comfort you. It came to expose what was done to you. When the proof finally surfaced, it didn't arrive gently or with concern for your healing. It didn't show up to validate your feelings or give you a moment of peace. It showed up to put a spotlight on behavior that was never meant to be seen clearly. Proof doesn't carry empathy. It carries clarity. And clarity can be uncomfortable, especially for the people who spent years shaping a version of you that made their actions look reasonable. For a long time, your pain was treated like an overreaction, not because it was exaggerated, but because acknowledging it would have required admitting something ugly took place. So instead, the focus was shifted onto you. Your emotions were examined, your tone was criticized, your reactions were questioned, while the original harm quietly disappeared from the conversation. Proof reverses that dynamic completely. It pulls the camera off your response and places it back on the cause. What makes this moment heavy is that exposure doesn't negotiate. It doesn't soften the edges or consider anyone's reputation. It simply reveals sequences, timelines, and patterns that were previously hidden behind confusion. Once that happens, the conversation changes. It's no longer about whether you're sensitive or misunderstood. It becomes about who said what, who did what, and how often it happened. And that's a very different room to be standing in. There's also a strange shock that comes with realizing the proof was never about proving you right. It was about showing how deliberate the damage was. Intent starts to show itself when things are laid out clearly. Repeated behavior stops looking accidental. Silence starts looking strategic. And what was once dismissed as chaos begins to look organized. That's why this kind of proof doesn't feel comforting. It forces a reckoning not just for them, but for anyone who looked the other way. It removes the luxury of confusion and replaces it with responsibility. You don't walk away from this feeling soothed. You walk away understanding that what happened wasn't random, imagined, or exaggerated. It was real, it was sustained, and now it can no longer hide behind your reaction to it. Number 2. The most dangerous thing for your opposition is not your voice, it's documentation. For a long time, people acted like your voice was the problem, like you were talking too much, explaining too hard, or reacting too strongly. But that was never the real threat. Voices can be interrupted, ignored, mocked, or drowned out. Documentation can't. It doesn't argue back, it doesn't get emotional, and it doesn't forget what happened last year when someone suddenly changes their story. It just sits there, steady and quiet, holding everything exactly the way it happened. What makes documentation so unsettling is that it removes control. When everything relies on opinions, whoever speaks louder or holds more power usually wins. But once things are written down, saved, dated, or recorded, power shifts. Suddenly it's no longer about who sounds convincing in the moment. It becomes about what can be verified. And verification doesn't care about charm, authority, or popularity. This is why people often push back hard against records. They'll call it obsessive, petty, or dramatic. Not because it is, but because it limits their ability to rewrite history later. When events are documented, lies lose flexibility. Stories can't evolve conveniently. Excuses have deadlines. And contradictions start showing up where confidence used to live. There's also something deeply uncomfortable about knowing that your actions might outlive your explanations. Documentation creates memory outside the human mind, which is famously selective. People rely on time to blur details, soften accountability, and create plausible forgetfulness. Records interrupt that plan. They don't fade. They don't reinterpret themselves. They stay consistent even when people don't. The real shift happens when documentation starts connecting dots. One incident can be dismissed. Two can be explained away. But when records show repetition, timing, and intent, the conversation changes tone. It stops being about misunderstandings and starts being about patterns. And patterns are hard to defend without exposing motives. That's why documentation scares people more than confrontation ever could. A voice can be silenced. A record becomes evidence. And once evidence exists, the story no longer belongs to whoever controlled the narrative the longest. It belongs to the truth that can be proven, quietly and without asking for permission. Number 3. Justice didn't move when you begged. It moved when patterns became undeniable. For years, you carried the weight of being dismissed. Every plea for recognition, every explanation, every attempt to clarify what had happened felt like shouting into a void. You weren't ignored because people didn't care enough to listen. You were ignored because systems, people, and power structures don't act on emotion or urgency. They act on evidence. Justice doesn't respond to how loudly someone cries. It responds to what can be proven, traced, and repeated over time. That's why begging, arguing, or pleading never worked. It was never the point. The machinery only started turning when the story stopped being a single incident and became a pattern no one could deny. Patterns are what expose intention. One lie can be brushed off. One oversight can be excused. One emotional breakdown can be framed as instability. But when incidents begin to line up, timelines overlap, and the same behaviors repeat across multiple points of reference, the illusion of randomness disappears. Suddenly, the story changes. It's no longer about you being difficult, reactive, or misunderstood. It becomes about someone else consistently showing up in ways that can't be explained away. And once that accumulation of evidence exists, inertia shifts. What was stagnant begins to move. The delayed movement of justice also carries a harsh lesson. It's rarely personal. Systems and people don't rush because they want to reward patience. They act when ignoring the truth becomes riskier than facing it. The patterns that finally force action are rarely neat or convenient. They're messy, unflattering, and often make those who dismissed you look like the ones who were out of order all along. When justice arrives in this way, it's quiet but decisive. It doesn't come to apologize for the wait. It doesn't arrive to comfort or soothe. It arrives to recalibrate the balance. The same people who once ignored, mocked, or minimized you are now confronted with a reality they can't deny. The patterns are undeniable, and suddenly the truth isn't yours to argue about anymore. It becomes theirs to account for. Number 4. The people coming forward now are not heroes. They're witnesses trying to save themselves. When people suddenly decide to speak, it rarely has anything to do with courage or morality. For years they stayed silent, smiled politely, or even actively participated in the version of events that made you look like the problem. They didn't come forward because they cared about the truth or because they were outraged by injustice. They came forward because the tide shifted and the truth became unavoidable. Once patterns of behavior, documentation, and evidence reach a point where ignoring them threatens someone's own credibility, survival instinct kicks in. Suddenly, silence is dangerous. Suddenly, complicity is riskier than exposure. This is why it's important to see their timing for what it is. The same voices that were absent when you needed them most are now conveniently present. The same people who laughed, minimized, or turned away are suddenly concerned. Their concern isn't selfless, it's protective. They want to be on record, want to be able to say later, "I spoke out," or "I warned them," in order to shield themselves from scrutiny. This doesn't make the evidence they provide any less valuable, but it does change the tone of what's happening. The spotlight isn't always on morality, it's often on self-preservation. Their sudden involvement exposes a layer of truth about human behavior. People don't always act out of principle. They act out of necessity when their own position is threatened. And once that necessity coincides with justice, the effect is dramatic. The same people who were invisible now become part of the chain that validates reality. They help force accountability, even if their motives are mixed, and even if their timing is self-serving. What makes this moment powerful is that it isn't about their bravery. It's about the fact that truth has a way of forcing movement, no matter who tries to ignore it. The people who show up late may not be heroes, but their presence ensures that the patterns, the proof, and the accountability can no longer be delayed. The story no longer belongs solely to the wrongdoers. It belongs to reality, and everyone can see it. Number 5. Being proven right doesn't heal you. It restructures how others must treat you. Finally, being validated doesn't wash away the sleepless nights, the anxiety, or the moments when you questioned yourself just to survive. It doesn't erase the frustration of being ignored, belittled, or gaslit. That part of the story, the emotional toll, the loneliness, the confusion, remains with you. What validation does is something far more precise. It changes the rules for everyone around you. It forces people to recalibrate how they interact, how they respond, and how much they can afford to underestimate or manipulate you. Suddenly, the same individuals who dismissed you as overreacting or too sensitive have to measure every word and every action because the proof makes missteps visible. This restructuring isn't polite. It's not gentle. It doesn't come with applause or congratulations. It comes as quiet, undeniable consequences. People start realizing that the old strategies of manipulation, dismissal, or gaslighting no longer work. Their assumptions about your compliance, your weakness, or your silence are exposed as false. They can no longer act freely in the same spaces or conversations without leaving traces that can now be traced back to them. The leverage shifts. And that shift is subtle, yet it is absolute. Being proven right also highlights an uncomfortable truth for those around you. Their previous perception of reality was false. They can no longer interact with you under the pretense that their narrative was accurate. Every interaction now carries weight. Every word spoken carries risk. Respect, or at least caution, becomes necessary, not because you demanded it, but because the proof enforces it. The empowerment here is not about feeling vindicated emotionally. It's about the practical shift in dynamics. It's about the subtle yet irreversible way that reality now forces accountability. You don't have to fight for credibility anymore. It's already been established. The world has no choice but to adjust, and that adjustment changes every relationship, every conversation, and every expectation moving forward. Being right in this way doesn't heal your past. It secures your position in the present and sets the stage for the respect and consideration you were denied for far too long. Number 6. The delay was strategic, not accidental. It's tempting to think justice or recognition took too long because people didn't care, or because the system was broken, or because the world simply overlooked you. The truth is harsher and more precise. The delay was strategic. Timing in these situations is rarely accidental. The longer the proof remained hidden, the more the lie could grow, the more narratives could be manipulated, and the more the wrongdoers could feel untouchable. Systems, whether formal or informal, tend to move only when inaction becomes riskier than action. Until that tipping point, the world doesn't rush. Silence is often a tool, not a failure. The strategy behind delay is layered. People and systems rely on confusion to protect themselves. Every contradiction, every missed detail, every dismissal buys them time. If the truth surfaced too early, it could have been discredited, ignored, or twisted to protect the wrongdoers. The timing of exposure ensures maximum impact. Evidence lands when it cannot be brushed aside, when witnesses are ready, and when inconsistencies have multiplied to the point where the story can no longer be denied. Delay, in this sense, is not negligence. It is preparation, whether intentional or inevitable. What this means for you is profound. Your patience, endurance, and persistence weren't just acts of survival. They were part of the natural course that allowed the truth to gain traction. The moment may have felt unfair or excruciating, but every day the proof waited. Every unnoticed detail that was recorded, every contradiction that went unchallenged, was building toward a tipping point that could not be ignored. The delay created power. Understanding the strategic nature of delay also changes how you see the people who doubted you. They weren't necessarily smarter, stronger, or more ethical. They were operating in a system that rewards timing and exposure. And now, when the proof finally arrives, that system forces accountability, not as a response to your begging or persistence, but because the moment has arrived where inaction is no longer an option. What felt like waiting for justice was actually waiting for inevitability, and inevitability has a way of rearranging everything. Number 7. What broke the case open wasn't outrage. It was consistency. For years, people assumed that loud protests or emotional outbursts would carry the day, that passion alone could convince others of the truth. That's not how change happens, and it's not what shifts the balance of power. What actually breaks a case open, What forces accountability to finally move is consistency. It's showing up the same way over and over, responding the same way despite pressure, and documenting your experience without bending to chaos. Consistency doesn't scream for attention. It quietly builds a foundation that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Consistency is what turns single incidents into patterns. One claim can be dismissed as a mistake. One emotional reaction can be misread as instability. But when behavior is repeated, when actions align with your words across weeks, months, or years, the truth begins to stand on its own. People who once doubted you start noticing that your story doesn't change. Their contradictions, however, begin to unravel. Consistency exposes not just your reality, but their attempts to rewrite it. The record becomes clear. The problem was never with you. It was with the way others manipulated the situation. Another powerful element of consistency is endurance. It's not just about being persistent. It's about refusing to mirror the chaos or distortions that surround you. While others scramble, explain, or argue to escape accountability, your steady presence becomes evidence in itself. It's like a quiet measure of reliability in a world full of excuses, and it starts to speak louder than any outburst ever could. When the proof finally surfaces, it often shows one simple truth. You didn't break, and neither did your reality. That steadiness dismantles doubt in a way that outrage never could. Anger fades. Opinions shift. Evidence becomes undeniable. People who once laughed, gaslighted, or dismissed you can no longer manipulate the narrative without exposing themselves. Consistency doesn't just win arguments, it forces the world to adjust to reality. And in that adjustment, the truth finally claims its power. Number 8, your so-called instability was actually the natural response to prolonged distortion. For years, people painted your reactions as erratic, unstable, or over the top. Every emotion, every flare-up, every moment of resistance was scrutinized, dissected, and framed as proof that you were the problem. They didn't see what was really happening. Your responses were entirely logical reactions to prolonged distortion and manipulation. When someone lives in an environment where their reality is constantly questioned, twisted, or denied, stress and emotional intensity aren't signs of weakness, they're signs of survival. Distortion works by breaking down certainty. It forces you to question your perception of events, your memory, even your instincts. When that happens repeatedly over time, a person's behavior naturally becomes heightened, defensive, and reactive. You were responding to a world that was attempting to rewrite your truth, not to your own imagination. Yet the people who orchestrated or ignored this manipulation didn't acknowledge their role. They pointed at your responses as the problem instead, as if a perfectly rational human could stay calm while their reality was systematically challenged. This perspective flips the story entirely. What looked like instability now reads as resilience. Every moment you held your ground, every time you kept going despite the confusion and gaslighting, wasn't a flaw. It was a signal that you were processing a hostile environment with the tools you had. The proof that surfaces now doesn't just clear your name, it reframes your reactions as measured, logical, and justified responses to what was happening around you. Recognizing this changes the narrative. It makes clear that the fault never lay with your ability to cope, but with the relentless pressure placed on you. Your so-called flaws were misdiagnosed, weaponized against you, and used to make you doubt yourself. Now, when patterns of manipulation are laid bare, the world sees what your behavior was really doing. It was surviving, enduring, and documenting reality under extreme conditions. What once seemed like chaos now reads as clarity, and the truth finally restores the dignity that was never yours to lose. Number 9. The investigation didn't start with belief. It started with suspicion toward them. It's easy to assume that when people finally began paying attention to your situation, it was because someone believed in you. That's not how it works. Investigations, accountability, and justice rarely begin with trust in the victim. They begin with doubt directed at the ones causing harm. Someone noticed inconsistencies, contradictions, or patterns in their behavior that didn't add up. It wasn't your story that triggered action. It was their suspicious actions that eventually became impossible to ignore. This is what makes the moment so powerful. The same people who dismissed, ridiculed, or gaslit, you are now under scrutiny, and every lie, every cover-up, and every attempt to rewrite reality starts to unravel. The focus shifts from defending yourself to holding them accountable. All the efforts they made to control the narrative, to discredit your reactions, and to erase your truth suddenly start working against them. Their own inconsistencies become evidence, their defenses become fragile, and the very strategy they use to protect themselves now exposes them. The subtle brilliance of this is that the system doesn't require emotional pleas or moral arguments to act. It only requires evidence that something doesn't align. That's why patterns, records, and repeated behavior matter far more than volume or emotion. Belief is irrelevant. Suspicion is catalytic. Once doubt exists and can be traced, investigated, and verified, momentum builds. It doesn't matter if people believed you before. What matters is that now the weight of their own actions is visible. This also explains why some revelations feel sudden, even if the abuse or injustice has been ongoing for years. The investigation isn't reacting to your timeline, it's reacting to when the opposition's missteps and patterns accumulate enough that ignoring them becomes impossible. The scales tilt, not because someone finally trusted your word, but because the inconsistencies in their story could no longer be hidden. And that is when the narrative flips entirely. The accused becomes the focus, and the truth you've carried all along finally has the space to be seen and recognized. Number 10. Accountability feels like an attack only to those who benefited from confusion. When the truth finally comes out, it hits differently depending on where you stand. For you, it's clarity, validation, and a long overdue sense of fairness. For those who thrived in chaos, however, it feels personal, like a sudden, sharp attack. The people who dismissed you, manipulated events, or twisted stories to their advantage suddenly find themselves exposed. Their comfort, their control, and their ability to avoid consequences are all slipping away. What feels like outrage from them isn't about justice. It's about losing the advantages they once had, the ones built on misdirection, disbelief, and uncertainty. Those who benefited from confusion learned early that when nobody sees clearly, they can shape the story however they like. They could manipulate perception, assign blame, and twist reactions without being questioned. Every misstep, every denial, and every quiet undermining became a tool that worked in their favor because no one could prove otherwise. They relied on a system where your reality was questioned and their intentions were assumed innocent. When proof emerges, that system collapses, and suddenly what was once invisible becomes undeniable. The interesting part is that accountability doesn't require anger, theatrics, or spectacle. It simply requires evidence and consistency. Yet for people who have grown accustomed to benefiting from distortion, it feels like an onslaught. They can no longer act freely, twist narratives, or rely on doubt as armor. Every action is now observed, every word is scrutinized, and every attempt to mislead becomes self-incriminating. For you, this is the tipping point. What once seemed like an endless struggle against doubt and dismissal becomes a recalibration of power. The scales shift subtly but permanently. Those who once controlled perception through confusion are forced to face a reality they can't manipulate. Their defensiveness, Their resistance and even their panic are just signs that their advantage has evaporated. What they experience as attack is simply the natural consequence of truth being allowed to exist, and for the first time, the rules of engagement have been rewritten in your favor. Number 11. Your role was never to convince. It was to survive long enough for the truth to surface. For years you carried the weight of being misunderstood, dismissed, or even attacked, and you probably felt like you were constantly in a position where you had to prove yourself. People told you to explain more, to calm down, to justify every reaction, but none of that would have mattered in the long run. Your role was never to convince anyone that your reality was legitimate. Your role was simply to survive, to endure the manipulation, the lies, and the relentless questioning long enough for evidence and truth to catch up. Survival in these circumstances isn't passive, it's active. Every day you held your ground, refused to fold under pressure, and continued to exist as yourself was a quiet act of defiance that built the foundation for eventual justice. Survival allowed patterns to emerge. Every incident, every inconsistency, every attempt to undermine you accumulated over time. Your endurance meant there was a trail, a record of events, and a living witness to the truth. You. Convincing people emotionally or morally wouldn't have mattered when the system, the environment, or the manipulators were structured to ignore feelings. But they couldn't ignore consistency over time. They couldn't ignore proof that built quietly while you simply refused to break. This perspective also reframes the struggle. Every moment you felt like you were losing, like no one was listening, or like you were alone, those moments were the very ones ensuring the truth would survive. You weren't failing. You were preserving reality until the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The truth isn't loud or dramatic. It's persistent. And your persistence, your survival, became the proof that eventually forced recognition, accountability, and justice. When the truth finally arrives, it doesn't need you to argue anymore. You've already done your part. You survived. That survival made you untouchable in a sense, because the evidence of endurance cannot be faked, and the truth you held onto for so long now demands attention. The work wasn't about persuading others. It was about outlasting the system and ensuring that the real story, no matter how long it took, could finally be seen. Number 12. The same people who doubted you are now afraid to speak loosely around you. Once the proof surfaced and patterns became undeniable, the energy in the room shifted. The same people who dismissed your feelings, questioned your sanity, or rewrote events to suit their convenience are now walking on eggshells. Their casual confidence has been replaced by calculated caution. Words they once spoke freely, jokes they once made at your expense, and offhand comments they assumed would go unnoticed now carry risk. They understand that any slip could reveal a truth they've been trying to hide, and for the first time their behavior is constrained by the reality they helped create. This shift isn't about respect, it's about awareness. They've seen how evidence doesn't forget, how timelines don't bend, and how accountability catches up. The casual arrogance they relied on has evaporated because they know you are no longer a target to manipulate silently. The power dynamic has subtly, irreversibly changed. They are forced to monitor themselves in your presence, because one careless word could undo months, years, or even decades of deception. The effect is almost tangible. Conversations feel tighter, humor is sanitized, offhand criticisms disappear. The same energy that once made you feel isolated and dismissed is now mirrored back to them in the form of cautious silence. It's a reversal that doesn't require confrontation. The proof itself enforces it. Every interaction becomes a reminder that reality now has a witness who cannot be silenced or misrepresented. This awareness alone is transformative. It marks the end of a cycle where others could act with impunity and the beginning of a new order where accountability is unavoidable. They may smile politely, nod, or pretend everything is normal, but internally, every word they consider, every move they make, is measured against the proof that exists. They've realized the stakes are no longer in their favor. The same people who doubted, mocked, or gaslit you are now bound by caution. They are no longer free to operate in the shadows of your truth. Your presence alone now holds a weight they cannot ignore, and the very environment that once empowered them now reminds them of what they have lost: control. Number 13. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like exposure and restraint. When people think about justice, they imagine dramatic consequences, outright punishment, revenge, or public humiliation. The reality is far more precise and often far quieter. Justice doesn't have to make noise to be effective. Sometimes it arrives as exposure, as the simple act of putting the truth on record, where it cannot be denied, altered, or forgotten. What was once hidden in shadows becomes visible, and the very people who relied on secrecy and manipulation are forced into a corner where every word, every action, and every decision is scrutinized. That alone changes behavior, without a single dramatic headline. Restraint becomes the natural consequence for those who benefited from wrongdoing. They can no longer act with freedom, influence, or arrogance. Doors they once opened easily are now closed. Privileges, access, and authority that once went unquestioned are now monitored and measured. The accountability doesn't always hit like a hammer, but it functions like a cage, subtle, precise, and impossible to ignore. Their power diminishes not through chaos, but through the slow, relentless effect of truth. This form of justice also carries a deeper resonance. It doesn't just punish the guilty, it protects you. By restraining the manipulators, it creates space for your stability and credibility to thrive. The system doesn't rely on anger or spectacle. It relies on a clear recalibration of influence. Those who operated under advantage now operate under limitation, and the balance shifts in a way that is permanent. Exposure and restraint are often overlooked as forms of justice because they lack immediate drama, but they are far more lasting than any fleeting punishment. A lie exposed, a pattern revealed, or a network of manipulation dismantled leaves a mark that cannot be erased. Those who once acted with impunity are forced to navigate a world where their actions have consequences they cannot control. This quiet, surgical recalibration doesn't just correct the record, it rearranges the environment entirely, ensuring that the truth has the authority it deserves, and that the people who tried to undermine it must operate within boundaries they can no longer escape. Number 14. The proof didn't restore your reputation. It dismantled the false one built against you. For years, people tried to define you on their terms. They created a version of you that served their convenience, a version that was unreliable, unstable, or even dangerous. That false narrative became your shadow, haunting every interaction and shaping how others perceived you. The problem wasn't that you lacked credibility. The problem was that someone else constructed a story so compelling and persistent that it obscured reality. The proof that finally emerged didn't just give you back what was yours, it tore apart the false version that had been weaponized against you. When the evidence lands, it doesn't negotiate. It doesn't tiptoe around social perceptions or comfort zones. It exposes what was fabricated, exaggerated, or manipulated. It forces everyone to confront the reality that the person they judged so harshly was never the person they thought they knew. Lies built to control, deceive, or discredit crumble under the weight of facts, and suddenly those who profited from the deception find themselves in unfamiliar territory. Their influence, authority, or moral high ground evaporates. This dismantling of the false narrative has a unique power. You're no longer trying to convince anyone of your truth because the story that opposed you no longer exists in the same way. The narrative shift isn't just symbolic, it's structural. Every interaction, every impression, and every assumption now has to contend with a record that contradicts the lies. The false version of you cannot be revived without exposing dishonesty. The framework that kept others in control of the story collapses, leaving only the truth in its place. The liberation here is quiet but profound. Reputation isn't about proving yourself to people who refuse to listen. It's about reclaiming the narrative that was stolen. By dismantling the false version, the proof doesn't just vindicate you, it forces the world to see you as you actually are. And once that happens, the influence of the liars diminishes, the distortion of perception ends, and the reality you carried alone for so long finally takes its rightful place. Conclusion. The journey from dismissal to recognition is never simple, and it's never quick. It's a road paved with doubt, manipulation, and endurance that most people will never witness. But when the proof finally emerges, everything changes. It doesn't just validate your experience, it reshapes the environment around you. The lies that were used to control perception crumble, the manipulators are forced into caution, and patterns of distortion that once seemed permanent become undeniable. What once felt like endless struggle transforms into a quiet but irreversible shift in power and perspective. Surviving the attacks, enduring the skepticism, and holding on to your reality was never about convincing others. It was about surviving long enough for the truth to gain momentum. Every act of consistency, every measured response, every moment you refused to bend under pressure became a piece of evidence that ultimately dismantled the false narratives built against you. Justice doesn't always arrive in dramatic headlines or explosive confrontations. It often arrives through exposure, through restraint, and through the precise, unyielding weight of truth. And when it does, it doesn't just restore what was stolen from you. It dismantles the system that allowed the lies to thrive. The power of this moment lies not in revenge or vindication, but in clarity. Those who doubted, dismissed, or attacked you can no longer operate with the freedom they once enjoyed. Their influence, control, and comfort have been recalibrated. Meanwhile, your resilience, endurance, and unwavering truth stand firm, unshaken, and undeniable. This is the point where reality asserts itself, where integrity finally receives the acknowledgement it always deserved, and where the world can no longer ignore what is indisputable. If this resonates with you, and you want to continue uncovering insights like these, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button if you found this truth as powerful as it really is. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences, and share this with anyone who needs to see that truth can no longer be silenced. Your engagement helps spread awareness, validates perseverance, and ensures that stories like yours are no longer overlooked.